Have you ever caught yourself thinking, do I really have the right to feel this way? Have you ever doubted your own feelings because someone else's trauma seemed quote unquote worse than yours, or because your trauma didn't fit certain narratives of physical abuse or neglect? If you answered yes to either of these questions, this YouTube episode is for you. Hi, I'm Annie Wright, a licensed psychotherapist and an expert in childhood trauma recovery. Every bit of my work in the world, including today's episode, What Even Is Trauma and How Do I Know If Mine Counts, all of my work is designed to support those who come from childhood trauma backgrounds to have the best adulthood possible. I'm so glad you're here, and I want to welcome you today. If you've ever experienced childhood trauma or had questions about the impacts of your personal history, I encourage you to subscribe to this YouTube channel and sign up for my newsletter in the show notes below. And now, as part of helping you have the best adulthood possible, despite how you may have started out in life, we're going to explore today's topic. What even is trauma? How do I know if mine counts? In this episode, we'll cover the following. What is trauma? Why trauma is subjective? What kind of events and circumstances might lead to trauma? And more. Before we dive into today's topic, I just want to say that I truly hope that what I share here can be of support to you. And very importantly, please remember, no matter where you're starting from, change is possible. Now, in the course of my 13 years as a therapist, I've heard some iteration of these two questions hundreds of times. What even is trauma, and how do I know if mine counts? Look, I'll never get tired of answering these questions, whether it's for my individual therapy clients or here on the internet with you. I'll never get tired of answering these questions because they were two of the dominant questions I wondered about for years, too. So I answer my clients and I share this information widely online because they're, quite frankly, the answers I would have so desperately wanted to know when I was 15 or 20 years old. So, with the hopes that this will feel helpful to you, let me share some psychoeducation with you. Let's begin with a broad, high-level overview of what trauma is and isn't. Now, this may feel redundant and obvious to you, but I still want to ground us into this 30,000-foot view and reiterate what you may already know so that this information and everything else I share in this episode is firmly cemented. I personally believe that psychoeducation for those of us who come from relational trauma histories is critical. The more you really understand the basics of trauma, not to mention the more you know about relational trauma specifically, the more easily you can see yourself and your life story more clearly and be equipped to seek out the right kind of support. So again, we start by asking the question, what defines trauma? What even is trauma? Well, trauma is subjective. I want to share a quote with you from one of my favorite trauma clinicians, Dr. Karen Sack-Bitney. Trauma is the unique individual experience of an event or enduring conditions in which the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed, and the individual experiences either objectively or subjectively a threat to his or her life, bodily integrity, or that of a caregiver or family. This quote guides my work with anyone who has experienced trauma, especially those of us who have experienced relational trauma, and I hope it feels helpful for you to hear. Why is this quote and what it represents so important? Well, for so long in my field and collectively by lay people, trauma was imagined as something only soldiers endured in war, or as a single terrible event like a car crash or a rape. And of course, these are all potentially very, very traumatic experiences. But in this current iteration of psychological traumatology, there has been an increasing and much needed understanding of the neurobiology of trauma, including the subjectivity of it. In other words, contrary to popular belief, trauma isn't relegated to just a discrete set of experiences or incidents like a car crash or wartime conflict. Instead, trauma now has a much more expansive definition. Trauma can be an event, series of events, or prolonged circumstances that are subjectively experienced by the individual who goes through it as physically, mentally, and emotionally harmful and or life-threatening, and that overwhelms the individual's ability to effectively cope with what they went through. The key here is the word subjective. What may make something traumatic to me may not to you, and so forth. As a clinician, I gauge trauma by whether my client's body is having a trauma response, not whether the precipitating incident was objectively traumatic. If a trauma response is present, then trauma was present. Again, I want you to understand that trauma is subjective so that we can answer that second question, how do I know if mine counts? Simply put, if it felt traumatic to you, it counts. Now, having grounded us in the realization that trauma is subjective and highly personal, there are still proverbial buckets of experiences we can categorize traumatic events and circumstances into that help us answer the first part of that question. What even is trauma? These buckets of trauma experiences, combined with the element of subjectivity, come into play when we talk about relational trauma, the focus of my entire clinical body of work in the world. And the reason is because when you endure relational trauma, as well as have traumatic experiences from any of these other types of trauma buckets, they can exacerbate the impacts of relational trauma, making it even trickier to work with. I'll be sharing more on this in future pieces, the compounding impacts of various forms of trauma. But for now, let's just quickly review those primary buckets of trauma that I mentioned. First, acute trauma. Acute trauma refers to a single incident, one-time event, such as experiencing a wildfire, car crash, school shooting, terrorist event, or house fire. Acute trauma is what so many of us historically and stereotypically think of as trauma. Second, chronic trauma. Chronic trauma refers to a set of experiences that are repeated and take place over time, such as enduring racial microaggressions, middle school bullying, poverty, exposure to violence in the community, or long-term medical challenges. Next, secondary trauma, also known as vicarious trauma. This type of trauma can affect people who help others cope with trauma, such as healthcare professionals, therapists, and first responders. It results from exposure to others' traumatic experiences rather than from direct personal experience. And finally, complex trauma, often called developmental or relational trauma. It's the kind of trauma that takes place over time in the context of a caretaking relationship, usually between a parent and child, that fails to adequately support the child's biopsychosocial development, such as in cases when ongoing neglect, sexual abuse, physical punishment, witnessing domestic violence, or being raised by a personality or mood disordered parent occurs. This complex trauma is the focus of my entire body of clinical work in the world. I'll be elaborating on how and why this particular kind of trauma is, in my personal and professional opinion, one of the most damaging kinds to endure in a future episode. But for now, hopefully by sharing this high-quality psychoeducation with you in today's episode, you can help answer the questions I would have liked to answer when I was 15 or 20 years old. What even is trauma, and how do I know if mine counts? So now, for today as we wrap up, I would love to know, did this information help answer one or both of those questions for you? How does realizing this support you and your healing work? If you feel so inclined, please leave a message below so that others can benefit from your share and wisdom. You never know who on the other side of the world you might be helping when you share your story. Finally, If you're still not sure if this content applies to you, if you're still not sure if you come from a childhood trauma history or suffer from its impacts, I would invite you to take my signature quiz. Do I come from a childhood trauma background? It's a 5-minute, 25-question quiz I created that can be incredibly illuminating and that will point you in the direction of a wide variety of resources that can be of further help to you. Plus, when you take the quiz, you'll be added to my mailing list, where you'll receive twice-a-month letters from me sharing original, high-quality pieces with accompanying YouTube videos and audios you can stream, all of it devoted to the topic of childhood trauma recovery, and where I share more about me as a person, my life, and how I'm journeying through my own childhood trauma recovery and general adulthood. My newsletters are the only place where I share intimate glimpses into my life, including photos, the resources that are supporting me, the things I've discovered that delight me, words that are uplifting me, the practices that nourish me, and more. So please, be sure to sign up for my mailing list, whether or not you want to take the quiz. I'll link to both of these things in the show notes below. Finally, thank you so much for listening to me today. I truly hope that even a small part of what I shared today felt helpful to you. If you found value in this information and would like to stay connected with my latest content, please consider giving this episode a like. It helps more than you know. Also, subscribing to my channel and turning on the notification bell ensures you're always up to date with my newest episodes. I appreciate your support and look forward to continuing this journey with you. So thank you, and until next time, please take such good care of yourself. You're so worth it.